The moment I learned they were reading my husband's will without me, I realized someone had already decided I did not belong in my own family. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was 69 years old when my husband of 44 years passed away, and for the first few weeks after the funeral, I moved through life as though I were walking underwater. Every room in the house reminded me of Thomas. His reading glasses still rested on the end table beside his favorite chair. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet exactly where he always left it. Even the silence felt different. It was not peaceful. It was heavy. I spent my mornings sorting through sympathy cards and trying to adjust to a future I never wanted. During that time, my son Jason and his wife Melissa called often enough to appear supportive. They checked in. They asked whether I needed groceries. They reminded me to take care of myself. Looking back now, I realized they were always careful to keep conversations short whenever legal matters came up. At the time, I assumed they were simply respecting my grief. Then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was at the local grocery store when I ran into my cousin Barbara near the produce section. We exchanged polite conversation, spoke about the weather, and discussed how difficult the past few weeks had been. Then she smiled gently and asked a question that stopped me cold. "Are you ready for Friday?" she said. I frowned. "Friday? The will reading," she replied. "I figured you must be exhausted preparing for it." For a moment, I honestly thought she was mistaken. "What will reading?" I asked. Barbara's smile disappeared. "Thomas's will. At Robert Sinclair's office. Friday morning." I stood there holding a basket of groceries while the world seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet. Nobody had told me about any meeting. I had received no phone call, no email, no letter, nothing. Barbara immediately realized something was wrong. She apologized and changed the subject, but the damage had already been done. I drove home with a growing sense of unease that I could not ignore. Once inside the house, I called Jason. He answered on the third ring. When I asked about the meeting, there was a brief pause before he responded. "Oh, that." His tone sounded strangely casual. "It is probably just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated. "Apparently there is a will reading on Friday, and nobody thought to mention it." Another pause. Then he laughed lightly. "Mom, I am sure the attorney's office made some kind of administrative mistake." Melissa joined the call a few moments later and offered the same explanation. Both of them sounded calm. Too calm. Their answers arrived too quickly, as though they had already rehearsed them. By the time the conversation ended, I felt worse than before I called. That evening I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring out the window as darkness settled across the backyard. My husband had always been meticulous about legal matters. Thomas believed in organization. He believed in fairness. Most importantly, he believed family members should never be excluded from important decisions. The more I thought about it, the less sense the situation made. If a meeting truly existed, why had everyone else heard about it except me? And if it was only a harmless mistake, why did Jason and Melissa seem so eager for me not to worry about it? As the clock ticked quietly on the wall, one thought continued returning to me. Someone knew about that meeting. Someone expected it to happen. And somehow, I was the only person who had been left out. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and found myself standing in the kitchen before sunrise, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. My conversation with Jason and Melissa replayed in my mind over and over. The words themselves were ordinary. It was the way they said them that bothered me. Their answers came too quickly. Their explanations felt polished. Most of all, neither of them sounded surprised that I had not been informed about something so important. If my husband had taught me anything during our 44 years together, it was that instincts should not be ignored when something feels wrong. By mid-morning, I decided to stop guessing and start looking for answers. I searched through every piece of mail that had arrived since Thomas passed away. Sympathy cards, utility bills, bank statements, insurance notices. Nothing from an attorney. Nothing about a meeting. Nothing mentioning a will. Then I checked my email account. Again, nothing. I even searched my spam folder. The result was the same. No invitation. No notice. No communication of any kind. Around noon, I called Robert Sinclair's office directly. The receptionist answered politely. I introduced myself and explained that I believed there was a meeting scheduled regarding my husband's estate. There was a brief pause while she checked her records. Then her voice changed slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Harper, there is a meeting scheduled for Friday morning." My heart sank. And when was I notified? Another pause followed. Longer this time. I could hear papers moving in the background. According to our file, notification was sent several weeks ago. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. I never received anything. The receptionist sounded uncomfortable. I understand. Mr. Sinclair is unavailable at the moment, but I can have someone contact you. I thanked her and ended the call. The answer only deepened the mystery. Someone believed I had been notified, yet I had not received a single message. That afternoon, I found myself thinking about the last few months of Thomas's life. Certain memories returned with unusual clarity. Melissa volunteering to organize paperwork. Jason offering to handle phone calls so I could focus on caregiving. Documents that were supposedly being processed for convenience. At the time, I appreciated their help. Now I wondered whether I had been seeing only part of the picture. Later that evening, Jason called again. His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. He asked how I was feeling and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. Eventually, I mentioned my conversation with the attorney's office. For the first time, there was hesitation in his response. Only a second or two, but enough for me to notice. Then he returned to the same explanation. Administrative error. Miscommunication. Nothing to worry about. I listened quietly. The more he spoke, the less convinced I became. After the call ended, I walked through the house and stopped in front of a framed photograph taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. Thomas stood beside me smiling, one hand resting gently on my shoulder. Looking at that picture brought an unexpected sense of calm. My husband was many things, but careless was not one of them. If there was a meeting concerning his final wishes, he would never have wanted me excluded from it. As darkness settled outside the windows, I made a decision. Whether I received an invitation or not, I would be there on Friday morning. And for the first time since Barbara mentioned the meeting, I began to suspect that someone might be counting on me not showing up at all. Friday arrived with a gray sky and a steady autumn drizzle that tapped softly against my windshield as I drove across town. I left the house nearly an hour early, not because the attorney's office was far away, but because I wanted time to think. The closer I came to the meeting, the more memories surfaced. During the final months of Thomas's life, he often spoke about responsibility. He worried less about money than about family. More than once he told me that misunderstandings become dangerous when people stop asking questions. At the time, I thought he was speaking generally. Now those conversations felt strangely relevant. When I arrived at the office building, I remained in my car for several minutes watching people enter through the front doors. The rain had eased into a mist. I could see several familiar faces from the parking lot. Relatives, family friends, people connected to Thomas through business and community organizations. The sight immediately confirmed something important. This was not a small administrative meeting. It was a significant event. Yet somehow everyone seemed to know about it except me. Eventually, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The receptionist recognized me immediately and greeted me politely. There was no indication that I was unwelcome. No suggestion that I should not be there. That alone contradicted everything Jason and Melissa had implied during our recent conversations. If the attorney's office expected me to attend, then why had I never been informed? As I followed the hallway toward the conference room, I heard voices before I reached the door. Laughter. Casual conversation. The atmosphere sounded relaxed. Then I stepped inside. The change was immediate. Several conversations stopped at once. A few relatives looked surprised. Others seemed uncomfortable. I noticed Melissa first. She was standing near the coffee table speaking with two cousins. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered and forced a smile. Jason reacted almost the same way. The moment was brief, but impossible to miss. Neither of them looked confused. Neither of them looked relieved that I had arrived. They looked caught off guard. I greeted everyone politely and chose a chair near the far end of the conference table. No one said anything openly hostile. In fact, most people were perfectly courteous. Yet beneath the polite greetings, I sensed tension. Something about my presence had disrupted expectations. As people settled into their seats, I found myself studying faces around the room. Some relatives avoided eye contact. Others appeared curious. A few looked genuinely confused. It was as though everyone possessed different pieces of information, but nobody understood the entire picture. 10 minutes later, Robert Sinclair entered carrying several folders. Conversations faded immediately. He placed the folders on the table, took his seat, and looked around the room. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of opening the documents, he paused. His eyes moved carefully from one person to another. Finally, he frowned slightly. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to confirm that everyone required to be present is here." The room remained silent. Robert checked a list. Then he looked up again. "Where is Mrs. Evelyn Harper?" For a moment, nobody spoke. Jason shifted in his chair. Melissa looked down at the table. Robert repeated the question. Then I raised my hand slightly. "I am right here." The attorney's expression immediately relaxed. He closed the folder in front of him and nodded. "Excellent," he said. "Now we may proceed." At that moment, every instinct I had been ignoring for weeks suddenly became impossible to dismiss. Whatever was about to happen, my presence was not optional. It was essential. Robert opened the first folder and adjusted his glasses while the room settled into complete silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows, but inside the conference room nobody seemed willing to make a sound. I noticed Melissa sitting perfectly still beside Jason. Both of them kept their attention fixed on the documents in front of the attorney. Whatever confidence they carried earlier appeared less certain now. Robert began with routine legal language. He reviewed dates, confirmed identities, and summarized the basic structure of Thomas's estate. Everything sounded normal, familiar, predictable, yet I could not shake the feeling that something larger sat beneath the surface. Several relatives listened politely. Others appeared bored. A few checked their phones when they thought nobody was watching. Then Robert reached for a second folder. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. He became more formal, more deliberate. "Before continuing," he said, "there is an additional matter that must be addressed." The room immediately became attentive again. Robert explained that during the preparation of estate documents, certain instructions had been provided directly by Thomas. These instructions involved specific conditions regarding the presentation of his final wishes. One condition in particular required the presence of a named individual before any substantive reading could proceed. Several people exchanged confused glances. Robert looked directly at me. Mrs. Harper was specifically identified by Mr. Harper as essential to this process. A quiet murmur moved through the room. I felt every eye shift toward me. Robert continued. Months before his passing, Thomas had updated portions of his estate planning. Those updates were accompanied by written observations regarding family communications, decision-making, and future responsibilities. According to Robert, my husband wanted those observations reviewed in the proper context and before the appropriate witnesses. Jason suddenly leaned forward. "What kind of observations?" he asked. Robert calmly raised a hand. "We will get there shortly." The response was polite but firm. Jason leaned back again without another word. As the attorney continued speaking, memories surfaced in my mind. During Thomas's final year, there were occasions when he seemed unusually interested in who handled paperwork. He often asked whether I had personally received documents. He occasionally repeated information twice, as though he wanted to ensure I heard it directly. At the time, I assumed he was simply being careful. Now I wondered whether he had noticed things that I failed to see. Robert removed several sealed pages from the folder and placed them on the table. Even from across the room, I could tell they had been prepared separately from the rest of the estate records. The atmosphere shifted again. This was no longer a standard legal meeting. Something important was waiting inside those pages. Melissa crossed her arms. Jason stared at the documents without blinking. The attorney explained that Thomas had requested these materials remain unopened until all required individuals were present. More importantly, he instructed that no substitutions, delays, or alternate arrangements were permitted. Hearing those words sent a chill through me. If my husband had gone to such lengths, then he must have anticipated a problem long before anyone else recognized it. Robert carefully broke the seal and reviewed the first page. His eyes moved slowly across the document. Then he paused. For the first time that morning, he looked genuinely concerned. He set the page down, folded his hands, and surveyed the room. "What I am about to read," he said quietly, "may answer several questions that have already been raised." At that moment, I realized the meeting was no longer about dividing property. It was about uncovering something Thomas had worked very hard to protect. Robert lowered his eyes to the document and began reading. The room remained completely silent. Even the faint sound of rain outside seemed distant now. Every person at that table understood that something unusual was happening. The question was what Thomas had left behind and why he considered it important enough to require my presence before it could be revealed. The statement began in my husband's own words. Robert explained that Thomas had prepared the document several months before his passing after noticing certain developments within the family that concerned him. He wrote that he deeply loved his family and hoped everyone would continue supporting one another after he was gone. At first, the message sounded like the kind of reflection many people leave behind. Then the tone changed. Thomas stated that over time, he became increasingly uncomfortable with how information was being managed around him. Several relatives shifted in their seats. Robert continued reading. According to Thomas, there were occasions when documents arrived that seemed inconsistent with conversations he remembered having. There were moments when messages supposedly delivered to family members never appeared to reach them. Most importantly, he noted that I often seemed unaware of discussions that directly involved me. Hearing those words felt surreal. Months earlier, I had noticed some of the same things but dismissed them as ordinary misunderstandings. Thomas had not dismissed them. He had documented them. Robert paused briefly before continuing. The next section explained why the document existed at all. Thomas wrote that if his concerns proved unfounded, then the statement would simply provide additional transparency. However, if his concerns proved justified, he wanted an independent record to ensure that certain questions would eventually be asked. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Robert reached for another page. This section contained a list of instructions. Several communications involving estate matters were to be reviewed carefully. Certain timelines were to be verified. Any attempts to exclude required participants from estate proceedings were to be documented and investigated. I noticed Melissa lower her eyes toward the table. Jason sat motionless beside her. Robert then revealed the detail that changed everything. Months before his passing, Thomas had requested that copies of specific correspondence be preserved separately from the main estate file. Those records had remained sealed until this meeting. The attorney opened another folder and removed several printed documents. These materials were retained at Mr. Harper's request, he explained. They have not been previously discussed. My pulse quickened. The pages contained email records, communication summaries, and notes regarding estate preparation. Nothing dramatic appeared at first glance. Yet as Robert described them, a pattern began to emerge. Several notices had been distributed to family members. Responses were received from some recipients, but not others. Follow-up communications reflected information that did not always match previous discussions. More importantly, certain records suggested that contact information associated with me had been modified during the preparation process. The room became noticeably tense. Robert remained calm and professional. He emphasized that no conclusions had yet been reached. The purpose of the review was to establish facts, not assumptions. Still, the implications were impossible to ignore. For weeks I had been asking myself why I never received notice about the meeting. Now it appeared that Thomas anticipated similar problems long before anyone else recognized them. As Robert organized the documents into neat stacks, he looked around the room once more. Mr. Harper believed transparency was essential, he said. For that reason, he instructed that all related records be examined if any concerns arose. Then he opened the final folder. Whatever sat inside caused his expression to become even more serious. And in that moment, I realized we were only beginning to uncover what my husband had tried so carefully to protect. Robert opened the final folder with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the meeting. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere inside the conference room felt completely different from when I first arrived. Earlier, there had been curiosity. Now there was tension. Every person present understood that the documents Thomas preserved were revealing a story far more complicated than a simple estate distribution. Robert removed several pages and placed them neatly in front of him. These records concern communications related to estate preparation during the last year of Mr. Harper's life, he said. His voice remained calm and professional. They were retained separately because Mr. Harper requested additional verification regarding certain administrative activities. The phrase additional verification immediately caught my attention. It sounded like exactly the kind of language Thomas would use when something bothered him, but he did not yet have enough evidence to draw conclusions. Robert began reviewing the records one by one. Some were emails. Others were notes from meetings. A few were correspondence logs maintained by the law office itself. Viewed individually, nothing seemed extraordinary. Together, however, they revealed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Several notifications intended for me appeared to have been redirected. Certain updates reflected contact information that did not match information I personally provided. In multiple instances, responses were recorded from my account, even though I had no memory of receiving the original messages. A relative sitting across the table quietly asked whether those discrepancies had been explained. Robert shook his head, not conclusively. Then he reached for another document. According to office records, concerns about communication accuracy first emerged nearly 8 months before Thomas passed away. One staff member noted inconsistencies involving delivery confirmations and recipient acknowledgments. The issue appeared minor at first, yet over time similar concerns surfaced again. Each incident by itself seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that eventually attracted Thomas's attention. Hearing that detail brought a flood of memories back to me. During his final months, Thomas occasionally asked whether I received specific information. Sometimes he seemed puzzled when I knew nothing about discussions others assumed I had already seen. At the time, we both blamed technology. Email systems fail. Messages disappear. People overlook things. Now those moments look different. Robert continued reviewing the timeline. Then he reached a section that changed the room completely. Several months earlier, Thomas requested an independent review of selected communications involving estate planning. He wanted confirmation that all intended participants were receiving the same information. The review produced findings significant enough that he ordered copies preserved with his personal instructions. Melissa shifted in her chair. Jason stared straight ahead without speaking. Robert carefully placed several printed emails on the conference table. The messages showed conversations about scheduling meetings, sharing documents, and confirming attendance. More importantly, they revealed repeated assumptions that I had already been informed about matters I never knew existed. Nobody needed to explain why that was important. The implications spoke for themselves. Then Robert revealed the detail that surprised everyone. Thomas had personally written a note attached to the records. In it, he expressed concern that information appeared to reach some family members more reliably than others. He emphasized that no decisions affecting his wife should ever proceed without direct confirmation from her. The room remained completely silent as those words were read aloud. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Even in the final chapter of his life, Thomas had been looking out for me. He had noticed things I failed to see. More importantly, he anticipated that questions might one day need answers. Robert placed the note back into the folder and folded his hands. Mr. Harper believed these concerns warranted further examination if circumstances required it. Then he looked toward another stack of documents waiting beside him. And based on what has already been reviewed today, there is one more set of records we now need to discuss. At that moment, I realized the evidence preserved by my husband had not reached its most important revelation yet. Robert reached for the final stack of documents and arranged them carefully on the table. By then, nobody in the room appeared relaxed anymore. The casual atmosphere that existed before the meeting had completely disappeared. Every relative, every advisor, and every family friend seemed focused on the attorney's next words. Even Jason and Melissa sat silently. Robert explained that after Thomas requested additional verification, the law office began documenting certain communications more carefully. The purpose was not to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It was simply to ensure accuracy. According to the records, Thomas wanted a complete understanding of how information moved between family members during the preparation of his estate. The attorney opened a folder containing communication logs and email records. He reviewed dates, recipients, and delivery confirmations. At first, the details sounded technical. Then a pattern emerged that everyone could understand. Several notices intended for me never reached my verified contact information. In multiple cases, alternative contact details appeared in estate correspondence without any direct authorization from me. More surprisingly, responses were received from channels that I had never used for estate matters. Robert emphasized that the records did not establish intent. They established facts. Facts that now required explanation. A cousin seated near the end of the table asked whether Thomas knew about these irregularities. Robert nodded. That is precisely why he requested independent documentation. The answer seemed to settle over the room like a weight. Thomas had not imagined the problem. He had observed enough inconsistencies to preserve evidence before his passing. Robert then displayed a timeline prepared from office records. The sequence showed when notices were sent, when responses were received, and when concerns first appeared. As everyone studied the timeline, another detail became impossible to ignore. Nearly every communication issue benefited the same outcome. Discussions moved forward without my direct participation. Decisions advanced while I remained uninformed. Meetings were scheduled based on assumptions that I already knew information I had never received. Nobody needed to say what everyone was thinking. The pattern spoke clearly on its own. I found myself staring at the documents while memories returned one after another. There were family conversations that seemed strangely incomplete, references to meetings I never attended, occasions when people assumed I already knew something important. At the time, I blamed grief, stress, and the chaos that often surrounds serious illness. Looking back, those moments suddenly fit together. Robert turned to another page. This document contained notes written by Thomas himself after several meetings with legal advisors. One passage stood out immediately. Thomas expressed concern that important family decisions might eventually be influenced by incomplete communication. He wrote that any attempt to minimize his wife's involvement would directly contradict his wishes. Hearing those words read aloud brought unexpected emotion to my chest. Even while managing his own declining health, Thomas had remained focused on protecting my place within the family. Robert then revealed the final item in the folder. It was a written instruction signed by Thomas and witnessed according to legal requirements. The instruction stated that if questions regarding communication integrity ever arose, all estate proceedings should pause until a full review could be completed. The room became completely silent. That single document explained why Robert refused to begin without me. It explained why my presence mattered. More importantly, it explained why Thomas insisted on safeguards that nobody else knew existed. Robert closed the folder and folded his hands. Mr. Harper believed transparency would ultimately protect everyone involved, he said. Then he looked toward another binder resting beside him. There is one final matter we must address before concluding today's review. As he opened the binder, I noticed something for the first time. Melissa's confidence was gone, and for the first time that morning, Jason looked genuinely worried. Robert opened the final binder and slowly removed a collection of documents that appeared newer than the records already reviewed. By that point, nobody seemed interested in the inheritance itself. The room had become focused on something else entirely. Every revelation uncovered another question. Every answer seemed connected to a larger pattern. Robert explained that after Thomas raised concerns regarding communication issues, additional safeguards were quietly implemented. Certain notices were duplicated. Selected correspondence was archived separately. Most importantly, a record was maintained showing exactly when information was sent and who confirmed receiving it. The attorney placed several pages on the conference table. These records concern the period immediately preceding today's meeting, he said. I immediately paid attention. Whatever was inside those pages related directly to the very event we were attending. Robert reviewed the timeline carefully. Notices regarding the estate meeting had been prepared weeks earlier. Distribution lists were verified. Confirmation requests were issued. Follow-up communications were documented. Everything appeared routine until the final stage of the process. That was where the records became interesting. According to office logs, notification intended for me had been altered before final delivery. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. Robert remained calm and continued presenting the facts. The records showed that updated contact instructions had been provided to the office. Those instructions affected how certain communications would be distributed. More importantly, the changes were submitted without direct verification from me. The room grew very quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the documents. Robert then displayed copies of the communication requests. For the first time, names appeared alongside the records. Jason and Melissa were listed among the individuals involved in coordinating family communications during the weeks following Thomas's passing. I noticed Melissa lower her gaze toward the table again. Jason sat rigidly in his chair. Robert emphasized that participation alone did not establish wrongdoing. However, the records clearly demonstrated that information concerning the meeting had been handled differently where I was concerned. One relative asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. Are you saying Mrs. Harper was intentionally excluded? Robert paused before answering. I am saying the records establish that she did not receive the same communication process as other required participants. The distinction sounded careful and precise, yet its meaning was obvious. Robert then presented the final document Thomas had prepared before his death. It was a personal statement addressed to the attorney. In it, Thomas explained that if his wife was ever absent from a significant estate proceeding, he wanted the reason investigated immediately. He specifically instructed that no assumptions should be accepted without verification. Hearing those words felt like hearing my husband speak directly into the room. Even after he was gone, he had anticipated the possibility that someone might try to push me aside. The attorney finished reading and placed the document back into the binder. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The silence itself felt revealing. Earlier in the meeting, explanations arrived quickly whenever questions appeared. Now there were none. No administrative error. No misunderstanding. No convenient excuse waiting to smooth everything over. Only records, dates, instructions, facts. Eventually, one of the relatives spoke quietly. So if Evelyn had stayed home, none of this would have happened today. Robert nodded. That is correct. The answer seemed to settle heavily over the room. I looked around the conference table and saw realization spreading across several faces. People were beginning to understand that the issue was never simply a meeting invitation. The issue was whether my husband's final wishes would be honored at all. Robert closed the binder and folded his hands. The formal review was nearly complete. Yet I could sense that the most important consequence was not legal. It was personal. The truth had finally become visible. And for the first time all morning, nobody could pretend they had not seen it. For several moments after Robert closed the binder, nobody spoke. The silence felt different from the silence that came before. Earlier, people were waiting for answers. Now they were absorbing them. The facts had been laid out carefully, supported by records, dates, and instructions written by Thomas himself. There was nothing dramatic about the presentation. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a steady sequence of evidence that explained why I had nearly been excluded from one of the most important moments following my husband's passing. Robert eventually resumed speaking and completed the formal reading of the estate documents. The financial details were straightforward. Thomas had organized everything with the same care he brought to every important responsibility throughout his life. Property allocations were clearly defined. Accounts were documented properly. Charitable gifts reflected causes he supported for years. Most importantly, his instructions consistently emphasized fairness, transparency, and respect for family relationships. As the reading concluded, I found myself paying less attention to the numbers and more attention to the people around the table. Several relatives appeared thoughtful. Others looked uncomfortable. A few quietly reviewed copies of the records that had been distributed earlier. Nobody seemed interested in debating what happened. The documents spoke too clearly. Robert then addressed one final issue. Based on the evidence reviewed during the meeting, additional administrative steps would be taken to verify communication records associated with the estate process. Certain procedures would be re-examined to ensure that Thomas's instructions had been followed completely. Again, there was no drama, no spectacle, just a commitment to accuracy. That was exactly the outcome Thomas would have wanted. As people slowly gathered their belongings, conversations resumed in low voices. Some relatives approached me to offer support. Others expressed surprise that I had not received information everyone assumed I already knew. More than once I heard someone say they thought I had chosen not to participate. That detail stayed with me. It reminded me how easily assumptions can reshape reality when nobody pauses to verify the facts. Jason remained quiet for most of the afternoon. Melissa spoke very little as well. Neither of them offered explanations. Neither attempted to challenge the records. For the first time in weeks, I found myself no longer searching for answers from them. The evidence had already provided what I needed. When the meeting finally ended, I thanked Robert for his professionalism. He simply nodded and handed me a copy of Thomas's personal statement. He wanted to make sure your voice could never be overlooked, he said. Those words stayed with me long after I left the office. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight pushed through the clouds for the first time all day. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. The folder containing Thomas's documents rested on the passenger seat beside me. In many ways, I felt the weight of grief more strongly than ever. I missed my husband. I missed his steady presence. I missed the certainty that came from knowing he was only a few steps away. Yet alongside that grief was something else. Gratitude. Even during the final chapter of his life, Thomas had continued protecting the values that mattered most to him. Honesty, fairness, respect. Looking back now, I realized the most important inheritance he left behind was not property or money. It was the truth. The truth ensured that his wishes were honored. The truth ensured that assumptions did not become